Today, I'm pleased to introduce you to Damon Kornhauser. Damon and I worked together at Campus, an edutech startup. I think it was maybe 2 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, sounds about right.
And Damon did something there that I just totally found fascinating called experience mapping. And so we agreed to talk about that today. I wanted to hear a lot about your thinking and experience with that type of work. And then I think we're also going to talk about the topic of building resilient work cultures.
Mm.
So, Damon, to start, do you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background and how you got into this space?
Happy to. And again, thanks for having me on the podcast. My origin story stretches back into a really long career in the hospitality industry. I, interestingly enough, started off. That was also the seed of learning and development. In one of my first early, waiting tables jobs before I moved to New York, I was tapped to build our training program. And so it was from a pretty early date that I started to correlate learning and development and how teams learn with the performance and the culture of that team, both customer facing and internally, of what it was literally like to come to work every day. And so that really planted the seed. And then I moved to New York to study what I thought was going to be arts administration. I thought I was going to get out of school and run arts organizations. And so I was very grounded in narrative and had a chance to go to what I like to call the Choose Your Own Adventure School of NYU, Gallatin, which is extraordinary if anybody wants to carve their own path. And what I created there was a program grounded in narrative anthropology, which was a Damon special, which to me was the story of what story do we tell, how do we tell it, and how has that story changed over the course of human history? And mostly through a lens of performative, but also through an organizational lens of what does it mean? What are the stories that we're creating organizationally? I had a really wonderful opportunity to work for some extraordinary and dysfunctional companies here in New York that are not on my CV, so don't go looking. I'm not going to embarrass anybody. But really wonderful organizations, and it blew my mind the question of how can such great producing organizations be so dysfunctional inside? And it really came down to not just culture, but what story and the mental models that were being created inside. And I got out of school and realized that it's really nigh impossible to pay your New York City rent in the arts industry, and ended up like so many back in the restaurant world, and was extraordinarily lucky early on to work with some really spectacular companies here in the city that really forged how I thought about experience and about service and about hospitality. And I realized that those two sandboxes, the narrative and the storytelling and the performative and the restaurant industry, were really doing the same thing. And that a restaurant is nothing other than an experience lab that is, cranking 300 people through the room a night, and that's a huge opportunity to play with service and to play with experience design. And I had an amazing career doing that in leadership and in consulting and working with some great brands, asking the question, which is one of my favorite design thinking or design questions: what do you want it to feel like? And then designing experiences based on what the brand wanted. And so in about 2016, like so many people in the restaurant industry, started getting a little existential about it, and decided to triple down into the education space, and had a chance to work with some really great companies, both from event design, innovation programming, building partnerships between higher ed and enterprise, and then just kept diving further and further into the more focused education space, which is where I am happily waking up every day now.
Wonderful. So you and I worked together when I joined campus for a while
Mm.
as an interim. I think my role was, let's see, I was interim VP of engineering. I think I think that was my title at the time.
Okay.
Uh,
I
um,
remember CTO, but sure.
it might have been CTO.
Yeah.
I don't quite remember, but um, you kind of embarked on this project and pulled in people from across the company in this experience map project. And I thought it was totally interesting and
Mm.
really, really valuable. Can you describe a little bit of like what problems you were seeing, or what made you pull the trigger on that and think, okay, in my busy day, this is I'm going to actually wrangle this and make this happen.
Well, like so many cross departmental initiatives and projects, this one started with as a brainchild of a member of the C-suite at the time, who I think had a sense of a potential, problem slash opportunity in the organization, and wanted to tap somebody to go look into that for me and come back and tell me what you see. The problem that we were wrestling with was so many different pieces of data and touch points of our quote customer, which in that case was a student, so user. But our students, we were trying to collect so many different pieces of information across so many different platforms, some of which are legally required as a Pell Grant dispersing organization, and as a regulated educational company, while also trying to make sure that students were staying inspired and wanting to show up on the first day of school, and sharing all the relevant personal information about their hopes and their dreams, and enrolling in classes. And so every department had their finger in this pot of, I need to know this, I want to find this out. We also want them to complete this. We want them to feel this way. And so, between academics, student success, uh, financial aid, et cetera, there were a lot of different parties trying to engage with the student with their own needs and wants and dreams. What I think the conversation was born out of was realizing that we weren't necessarily thinking of it from the student's perspective, that everybody was berating, and that one of the reasons that students were not showing up on day one was because of the not the desolation of contact, and we just weren't leading them properly, but too much contact. And so I think to put it succinctly, the problem we were trying to solve is how do we actually simplify all of these touch points and engage with them with more intention, both in terms of the meaning of each touch point, but also placing it within a larger narrative, a larger story, that ultimately is built around the student, which is the best way to get them to show up anywhere, is to make it about them. And so the question that I was charged with is identifying how we could start to approach streamlining all of these different touch points and all of these different data points, into one simple cohesive thread, which is never going to be simple and never going to be cohesive. But let's see if we can get a little bit further. The second problem was the visibility of each of those departmental engagements to the other departments. It was really hard to understand that, oh, financial aid's already asking them for that. Or they're going to do this touch point here. And so there was no coordination. From my perspective, I'm financial aid. I'm only reaching out 4 times to get 4 different forms filled out. Well, every department is doing that over the course of however many weeks. And so they're getting emails every day, twice a day. And so let's just get in a room. Let's see how each one of us is engaging naturally. Let's put that on a timeline just to see how overwhelming the student might be. And then let's move with some intention towards refining that and bringing a better design level to it.
So as the representative of engineering at the time, I found this totally interesting because engineering was also doing the same thing in that we had all of our, user experience, ways we were influencing the user experience, and we were totally blind to what everybody else was doing. And when we kind of mapped it out, it was a little bit shocking. It was like, oh
Yeah.
no, what have we done? Like all of us were locally optimizing, but we weren't actually designing it or like integrating our experience. Can you tell me about what that experience was like? What was hard about it? What that experience felt like putting it
Yeah,
together?
happy to. Um, I I decided to not try to fix anything out of the gate. Really, phase one was just figuring out what steady state level setting was. Where are we even starting from? And for better and for worse, that really ended up constituting the bulk of what where we took it to, and what we can unpack that in a moment as well. And so, really, I just started with departmental discovery interviews. I sat down with a representative of each department, ideally somebody pretty senior, and I basically wanted to be like, talk me through, share me on, let me see every document we share, every email that goes out, what data we're collecting, what are the fields that we're collecting, and then also just kind of, humanly riff on what that means and what do you want that to mean. And I was making just copious notes pretty early. I'm trying to remember actually how I started wanting to capture the data. Beyond my notebook, pretty quickly it became apparent that this was an opportunity to not just capture the data points of a student, but also to capture the data points that represented um, the intention or the experience of each touch point. An example there might be we're sending out the email from student success to talk about career aspirations. How are we capturing that? Or they are enrolling in classes. How are we capturing what classes and what the learning outcomes of those classes are? And so it ended up going pretty deep into um, the functional data that was getting requested and shared back, the experiential data, and then also the learning data. Because ultimately, the way that I wanted to approach this is a learning journey. How do we trace everything that we're asking back to their, and this is a big campus word, is purpose. And how do we continually remind the student that this is driving their purpose forward? And that is why we are asking and engaging in these questions. Nothing should ever be asked or requested in a, what is this for? I don't get it. Why am I filling this out? But rather creating this continual culture, and we can talk about sort of building the cultures of these things too, but making sure that the student always understands the journey that we're asking them to come on and why they are coming on it.
Yeah, what I remember was that we after a few phases we ended up with kind of a shared Notion
Hmm.
doc that was pretty complicated.
Yeah, so I tend to be a very visual person, and also as I think about things from that narrative arc standpoint, it made sense that some form of a timeline was the best way to display this. And taking advantage of the technical tools that we had, what was in our SAS playbook, I think I ended up using Notion and the Gantt, effectively the table slash Gantt function of Notion. I originally thought I might do kind of a systems map in a Google Slides Figma style, and that just got way too complicated, way too fast with as many different types of data points as I wanted to be collecting. Financial aid information, curricular information, etc. And so what doing it as a relational database set me up to do is be able to compartmentalize each of those categories of information and then to display it and filter it and sift it in any way that we want it. And so when we all gathered around the boardroom table, what we were looking at was effectively a Gantt chart of each department, every touch point that they're having mapped against every other department. And so you could see, and a good context actually for the whole project is to remind that the the scope of the project was from application through the first 6 weeks of enrollment. That was the timeline that we wanted to start looking at, rather than biting off the entire 2 years plus all of the months leading up to their first day of class. So it was a presumptively narrow scope that became pretty quickly pretty fast, or pretty complicated pretty fast. And so what you ended up seeing was every department mapping out all of their touch points above and below every other department mapping out those touch points. And so you could go at T-4 weeks and see all of the different touch points that were competing effectively. But when we started to map out the different data points that we were asking for, let's just put it in the context of career aspiration. Student success is asking that, academics is asking that, their application is asking that. You start to ask the question of, well, why are we asking this question 3 different times at 3 different times? And what is that translating to the student in terms of our ability to understand what information they're sharing back? Why are you asking me this question 3 times? Who is it getting to? And that, I would say is one of the simple desirable outcomes is ask a question once, make sure that we are communicating competency by getting it to where it needs to go. Much harder said than done, especially if you want to act on that information. But that was the intention. And so we all basically had this beautiful, complicated, multi-vertical Gantt chart that enabled us to start to map and even nudge things around, especially once we started to play in um, dependencies of, oh, I need that form before that happens. That then starts to open up these conversations of how we might move things around to make a better experience and also to better move the information around the organization.
I just loved what this made possible. And I guess my experience has been with this type of cross functional work. It's often really hard to fully land it as much as you would like, because people are just pulled in so many different directions. And often something like this, it can be hard to get everybody fully using something like this as a source of truth. And
Mm-hmm.
so I guess I'm kind of curious, like what impact you felt like it had, what were missed opportunities, and what would you have done differently? What was a smashing success? Like just kind of reflect on that a little bit.
I joke that I am a really very good over engineer. I can certainly overwrought any system you can throw at me. And so I think people got into the room and really appreciated the complexity of what we had intentionally and unintentionally built as a company, of the way that the whole system worked. Knowing where to stick your finger in the wall of, or which of the first levers to pull is a challenging prospect, especially when you effectively are a startup and are moving so fast already. And so many changes are being made quarter over quarter by the learnings that you are generating every quarter, that adding in another layer of iteration is very challenging. And I think, as I imagine, as many of us know, for any systemic change to happen, there has to be leadership buy-in through and through. And so the moment attention gets drawn off of an initiative like this, there's
Yeah.
no charter to move it forward. It
Yeah.
becomes a really interesting artifact, and that was a great learning. But in the measure what matters kind of world, um, it's really, unless somebody's asking the question, nobody's going to volunteer the answer.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, to put it really simply, to have had a requirement of walk out of this room with one thing that you can change would have been great. The problem with that is that what we were shining a light on was that no one department can make any one change. It was
Yeah.
actually showing the complexity of the system, and that required very coordinated response. And so when you're still just trying to carry water, chop wood, and get students to show up and make sure they do their homework and get the financial aid forms filled out on time, um, something's got to give.
Yeah, that was kind of my take on it as well. I felt like it was an incredibly valuable exercise to run, and that something like this is really challenging to like weave into the fabric of a company unless you have some sort of mechanism for it.
Yeah.
And that you know that wasn't at the time maybe the priority, but it seemed like an incredibly high leverage way of like problem solving
Mm.
the essentially the product that you're offering your customers, or the experience you're offering to people. Like it just gives you so much more leverage and so much more ability to shape that experience.
I think you touched on something that it might have actually grown out of, and I know that I've thought about this before, which is so many of our orgs, especially in the education space, are built on multiple platforms that are not necessarily communicating with one another. And so we can't just press a button and see all of the engagements on a dashboard. And so the necessity, quote unquote, of me doing what that project was trying to do grows out of that disconnect across our SaaS, and is trying to create visibility into the uninteroperability of all of these systems. And so I think to your point, yeah, if you could just generate the overarching single solution system that is already mindful of all of the entire journey, then it might solve that. But right now, historically, we're trying to piece that experience across all of the different systems we're using.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have you done this exercise at other companies? I believe you had done something kind of similar or earlier, like variations on this before. And if so, can you kind of tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, sure. And I might actually touch on before and a little bit of after as well. So this grew out of a model, a template that I took and made my own over years. Listen, like experience design is not a is
Yeah,
it's been around for a second.
yeah.
But what I enjoy doing is taking the fundamentals of service strategy and experience design, and bringing in some creative design style thinking and exponential thinking. And so thinking about a touch point to me is a really great opportunity to make sure it kind of traces back to plans are useless, planning is indispensable quote. And so it's a great opportunity to ask the question, what is the user really want? What does a win look like in this touch point? What does a loss absolutely look like? And let's make sure that we're not accidentally building towards that. And then what does a 10 times win look like? And then what is the functionality of this touch point? What do they have to accomplish? And so some of this is sort of the business model canvas. What's the pain point? What's the gain? What's the job? But then also using that as a creative launching point. The thing that I also love to do when I used to do this in the hospitality industry is make sure that every touch point is mindful of all of the ones that have come before and everything that is coming after. And that goes back to that building a narrative, because we might not be thinking about the other department and their touch points and their engagements, but the user certainly is. And they know that when they get the email on day 34, that they're thinking about all of the ones that have come before and what is the arbitrary experience we're accidentally creating. That's an opportunity to bring some intention. And so, what I would say is, Campus was certainly the most complex version of this I had done to date, because of the application across so many different departments and with so many legally required touch points. That was fascinating to me, of what we're asking when because we have to, and then what are we asking when because we want to, and then putting all of that through the lens of what feels best to the student.
Sometimes I think a lot about things like organizational design,
Mm,
and it's it's almost a truism in leadership circles that your work product and what you present to customers is often more reflective of how you're organized than how you're trying to design for the customer. And I guess what I love about this is it's kind of a counter pressure to that. It's a way of kind
mm,
of forcing your organization or helping your organization design experiences around the actual needs of people rather than just the needs of the people doing their job within a company. And it's totally logical that we will produce these like actual terrible experiences for people
yeah,
because we're doing what is naturally we're optimizing for our own job. And
yeah,
it's so interesting, just like the dynamics of how this is just totally logical that we would end up with these bad experiences.
yeah. I actually think that the reservation company OpenTable, and I haven't been in the industry in a decade, but one of the brilliant things I think that they did was there were in any guest profile in the system, there were restaurant notes and there were guest notes. Guest notes traveled with the guest to any restaurant that they booked through the open table system. So things like likes, allergies, that became visible to everybody.
Wow.
And it was such a delightful way of being able to make really important information portable. and to not have to repeat yourself every single time, or even better, for a restaurant to bring some initiative when the reservation is made and say, oh, by the way, I do know, I see in your notes X, Y, and Z. And the guest is like, I've actually never booked with you. How did you know that? And you're like, because that's what we do. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, you
Yeah.
can be like, "Oh, I just wanted to let you know we do have a gluten-free menu, or we
Right.
do,
Exactly.
exactly whatever your needs are." That's really amazing.
And then tracing it back to education and touching on some more recent conversations, I do find it fascinating that there are variations of this conversation I've had with multiple organizations. There's an ongoing wonderful org I've been talking to, and they are highly functional. They collect a lot of data. They bring incredible intentionality. I think their students would say that they feel seen and heard. And yet, the leadership team of that organization wants to do better. And so, what they have articulated is that they don't feel that the student as a holistic being is the mental model that everybody on the team is engaging with. That still the instructors are doing their thing. Everyone's doing a great job, but that there is still an opportunity to make the student the center of the experience. And how might we leverage technology to do that and data? Um, and you know, I think their experience of the opportunity or the challenge of that is because of the fractured systems that we use. And so the desire to see, I don't know that I've really thought about it before, but does it really does our technological craving come from our human side of we want to see a person as a holistic being in front of us. We just can't get the tech to do it for us. And so that's a really kind of delightful craving that we're trying to an itch that we're trying to scratch with our tech that just isn't there yet.
Yeah, yeah. I really love this practice. I love this type of thinking. I think it's actually something I can't think of a company that wouldn't benefit from
Mm,
this type of thinking and this way of organizing around customers. I mean, sometimes you do see certain roles that will naturally take on some of this. Like you'll see product management that is like thinking about the whole customer experience or
mm,
something like that. But it's rare for it to be this coherent, and I like the idea of this map as a way of kind of bringing cross-functional partner people together
mm.
to partner on and kind of have a source of truth of like what the experience is like. Do you have any advice for anybody that is thinking about engaging in some sort of an experience map?
I think my first answer might be a little philosophical, but I go back to an early theater professor of mine, who, when we watched any play or read any play or talked about any story, always asked the question, "What is this the story of?" And it was not a chicken crossing the road is not the answer. Um, Creature forging out against adversity across seas of it's however we want to define that. And so however you can inhabit the customer, the user's experience, understand what their overarching experience is with your brand. um, Even in the hospitality industry, one of the things I used to drill in was that an experience starts when they become aware of your brand, not even when they make the reservation. And so everything is contributing or detracting from that story, um, including your competitors' opinions of you, should that become part of the narrative. Um, but as much as possible, really try to understand your user's experience of your brand, through their experience from start to finish, and how that gets layered and layered and layered. Everything is an accumulation of the touch points that have come before. That's number one. And then ask questions. Try to break it. It is too easy to get overwhelmed with this stuff. So pick a few touch points. Pick five. You know, one in the middle, one in the beginning, a couple at the end, or just ask the question: what are the most important, meaningful moments of? Obviously. What's the call to action? What's the conversion? Where is our predominant drop off? Where is attrition happening? I worked for a brand. This is such a lovely sentiment. I worked for a brand that that programmed that using the tools at our disposal realized when a customer was engaging for the second time. That became the most important touch point because that is when somebody becomes a regular or decides if they're going to become a regular or not. So like that, pick your starting touch points. Ask the question, what is the function of this? What is, from an organization standpoint, what does the customer need out of this? What do we need out of this? And are we just even at table stakes delivering on that? And then ask the question of what would be 5 times better. And this is where I love to play with lo-fi exponential thinking, is going back to the actual emotional experience of that touch point. What is this supposed to feel like? And
Mm.
then what would it look like 5 times better? 5 times better than that. And if you can isolate and define what that moment could feel like with 10 times the resources, you can almost always figure out a way to do that in a really simplified way. And that is the secret of like surprise and delight. It does not have to be expensive. It does not have to be ornate. There are really lovely, simple ways to express concern, recognition, and consideration in a touch point. And so start there and talk to everybody else in your org. Um, I would say that the biggest challenge I have seen with initiatives like this is that they're very hard to make organizational wide because everybody's telling a different story. And so to put the student at the center of the experience is really hard and does require C-suite level buy-in and continual reinforcement. Um, I'm a big lover of templates because if you give somebody the template of what they have to fill out on a daily, weekly, whatever basis, then those are the questions that they're thinking through. And so you have to hardwire it, or at least soft wire it into the general cadence of what we're talking about. What are we thinking about? What behavior is getting rewarded?
So in the past, you and I have talked a bit about building resilient work cultures. Can you tell me a little bit more what you mean by resilient work cultures and building those into your organization?
I didn't write this line down, but it's occurring to me now, which is how an organization navigates failure. I think is a really great starting point. And it doesn't have to be big failure. It can be, we just didn't land that project. We didn't land that presentation, whatever it is. Is it a culture of recognition, iteration, rapid learning, and moving on, or is it one of retribution, punishment? How do we fail? How do we fail together? Um, and that I don't necessarily mean that in an overly um, touchy feely kind of way, but I think what it does is it speaks to, okay, what do we care about? Do we care about identifying where our failures were rooted from a human standpoint or from a systems and process standpoint? And so how we ask that question enables how far, I mean, let's use the definition of resilience, right? Like how far can we bend the reed before it breaks? And so resilience has to do with how well you adapt to the winds that are impacting you. Um, how adaptable are you to whatever's coming at? I think that how we implement the systems of continual learning and improvement and communicating how what the impact, what are the consequences of failure or lack of performance or what have you. Um, and to me, so much of it does come back to trust, and not just. I don't mean trust necessarily in oh, he's going to deliver on time. Trust is about understanding and accepting the consequences of anything, of knowing what will happen, and being able to operate in that system without having to burn gray matter in uncertainty. Um,
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. And so resilience is about, like I'm not afraid. I mean, that's really at the end of the day, we're talking about how is fear manifested in your organization? Are we using energy to play defensive ball, whether it's departmental against the customer or individual fear for what happens if I don't nail this project.
What are some things that leaders can do to like help their organization embrace change?
There's an interesting parsing of the question apart in between how can leaders do that and how can organizations do that.
That's a
From a
great.
leader standpoint,
Hmm.
it reminds me of how many managers and leaders I've worked with, who are committed to the way it needs to be done and what it needs to look like when it is done. Rather, what is the output and the outcome need to look like? What are the conditions of success? And whatever you want to do that achieves that within the resources and the culture and the experience that we've all committed to. This is actually one of the reasons why I think experience design is so critical, because it answers the question what you want it to feel like. If you can do that, then you can you can reverse engineer the things that need to happen to get you there. That then becomes a really wonderful brief to hand to your team and say, these are your resources, this is the project constraint, these are all of the data schemas that you need to be able to plug into, and extract from the experience. Have fun, like go have it,
Yeah.
and for them to know that there will not be punishment for an iterative process that comes out of that, or be clear about that. Say, we're going to go through 2 rounds of revision, bring to me your rough draft, I'll give you notes back. And so a lot of it becomes about how a leader communicates the adaptation as a collective experience rather than as a, well, you better get it right. You're on your own. And I've got the answer upstairs. So, it's going to be Friday at 5 p.m. and don't let me down kind of situations. Um, but then I think on an organizational side, um, the way that organizations share failure, lowercase f, how they learn, how they disseminate the learning of failure across, I think might be one of the denominators of organizations that can adapt to change really, really well versus the ones that can't. Are failures put in a closet and never seen again and never talked about, or do we try to amplify them and turn them into teaching moments?
One of the challenges I've personally had as a leader in some organizations is that there might be competing models for how to respond to failure, where
Mm-hmm.
I am trying to build more appreciation for failure as a source of learning, and perhaps other leaders are a little bit more blamey, or
Mm.
maybe they would say they're more focused on accountability. I guess what has been in your experience kind of navigating um, doing that at kind of a system wide level when there's actually a lot of different varying levels of support for that type of like what desire to build a resilience within the organization? Like, does this need to come from the top? Can it be done in local bubbles? What is your thought about that?
Well, the unfortunate thing about failure is it doesn't keep the lights on. And so we still need to deliver the thing by the date,
Absolutely.
at all costs.
Yeah.
And if you have the resources to fail a few times and still show up to the church on time, then I think your runway is longer, and the need to embed that culture in the broader organizational culture is probably a little looser. Um, I I would say that high functional, adaptive organizations have figured out how to talk about goals and to talk about resources, um, and honestly, also to be more agile, capital A, work in sprints so that we can make corrections along the way, so that, um, I'm intentionally going to leave this as a dangling paragraph. I was talking to a very, very well known firm once, and I asked them how they dealt with, uh, I'm trying to remember exactly how I phrased it. How do you deal with a project when it goes off the rails? I believe is exactly how I phrased it. And their response was, that doesn't happen here. And I thought that was incredibly arrogant, but also based on who they are and their prestige and their reputation, probably not that far off the mark. They have institutionalized ways of measuring and tracking and making adaptations along the way in a way that nothing ever implodes. Customers never experience failure. We operate as a collective being that can adapt to sparks and fires that are going to happen,
Yeah.
so that they never get out of control. Um, those are sort of answering my own question. Like those are the organizations that turn into 100-year companies, of how they do that.
You can still have like very high standards and be uncompromising and like no, everything has like we have to offer superior experiences and hold yourself to a very high standard. Learning is not actually counter to that at all. It actually is how you get there, and it's so there's a way in which that's kind of a false dichotomy.
It
It's
is.
much more about like we want to be the best we can be. We want to offer the best experiences we can. So we're going to learn from our failures because that's the richest source of learning. And we already we already paid the cost of it. We might as well accrue some of the benefit.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah.
you sort of hit it with the dichotomy piece too, right? From the street, it's a big glass building that looks austere and sterile and a behemoth. But inside, everybody's flowing like water, and that's what enables them to gain reputation and gain. That's it, like confidence, right? It's like how do you? We're gonna actually, I'll trace it back to trust. Like you're building a trustful organization. That is, um, the resilience grows out of um, knowing what to expect.
Yeah. And I don't know if this really gets back to the experience design, but there's a way in which I've also seen learning as a and holding yourself to high standards and so on. Like there's a way in which that actually makes the experience of failure very different for employees, where it's like, wow, we really screwed up here. And let's make sure we do better and we get better as a result. It feels way better than just we screwed up.
Yeah, it reminds me of the "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed"
Yes.
line. I remember somebody once shared with me. A former employee once shared that was um, a collective emotion that the team had, and I like to think that the team had extraordinary affection for me. We got along great. I would consider us really high performing, but I had no idea at the time that there was also this underlying fear of like you don't want to disappoint Damon.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about anger because I never got angry. It was like about what we. That's not true. There's a couple moments I get angry, but it's so interesting because I think that also reveals the are we all trying to tell the same story? And so in the moments of quote failure, um, it's not that I didn't submit the form or do the functional thing. It's that I poked a hole in our story, and that is a crime. If you fracture the illusion, if you can see behind the curtain of whatever it is, then the magic is lost a little bit. And that, if you can make that a collective investment by your team to want to continually tell the story, if it's a good story and it's an honorable story, then that's a pretty good organizational keystone to try to keep in place.
It's also like one of the best things that I think humans do is like when we create something that is so valuable that people relate to it and like
Yeah,
you've created something really like amazing and it's so hard to do that with a group of people and
it's hard.
like it it's actually totally magic when you're a part of an organization that's operating that way.
It's
It's just the
incredible,
best thing in the world.
truly.
Um, Damon, this has been so much fun.
A delight.
It was so much fun. Yeah, totally a delight. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to find you on the internet?
Um, I welcome email from anybody. Damon, Damon, at appliedhumanity.com is my personal brand. Um, and then where else am I? I'm on LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect there. I'm not as consistent on the social channels as I aspire to. I'm coming. Um, and then, yeah, it's a good place to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Jade.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Decoding Leadership. As always, I welcome your questions and feedback. And if you're looking for coaching or advisory help, you can contact me at rubik.com. See you next time.